Hi everyone, I'm super excited to host Brian Wrigley. He's a product manager in construction division at Boston Dynamics. If you are in AC space, you have heard about Brian, so I don't need to talk much more about it. And if you are not aware, I became a fan of Brian's podcast, which was like amazing series of awesome AC tech people. It was very insightful and very interesting vibe these guys created in their podcast. So highly recommend to check that out. But before that, I I'm aiming this podcast to focus more on Brian's journey and uh, discover what are the reasons he's still doing work which he's doing today. What are some revelations and realizations in AC tech industry. So without much ado, Brian, can you tell us about your background, where you grew up, and out of all things you can do in life, why architecture?
Yeah, thank you so much for the nice introduction and for having me on. Yeah, how far back do you want me to go? Do you want to go all the way back? I was born on an Air Force base. That's a fun fact. I sometimes wonder if that's why I'm so obsessed with machines. Architecture. I wanted to be a doctor. I think most of my childhood, because my aunt was a pediatrician. I looked up to her, but I think in when I was like 12 or 13, I started taking drafting classes and became like really enamored with drawing and with geometry. And then that led into 3D modeling and actual architecture classes at my high school. My high school was very like kind of trades oriented. Um, so we had like carpentry and drafting and architecture class was basically just like the basics of like home blueprints and things like that. We used software called Home Architect Deluxe, which you could buy at like Office Max. Was actually pretty cool, and I think technically BIM because you could do quantity takeoffs with it. So it was like meant for if you were like building your own house, you could go to the lumber store and know like basically like how many lineal feet of lumber you would need to frame your house yourself. So that was kind of cool. And that's also that same class. We used Rhino in that class as well. Um, so I've been doing NURBS modeling since I was about 14. We used Bryce, which was a landscape thing. So that's where we would make the landscapes, and then we would make the architecture in either Home Architect Deluxe or Rhino, depending on what type of architecture we were doing. And then we would composite all together in, oh God, what was it called? Some, it wasn't Photoshop, but it was some like Photoshop-esque
Hmm.
thing. So that all got me really like excited. And there had been a few people from my high school. I went to high school in Ohio, in a town called Mansfield, Ohio, where they filmed Shawshank Redemption. I think that's like the only thing it's known
Well,
for. Oh, and they make carousels there, so that's another fun fact. But there had been a few people from my high school who had gone to the architecture school at Cincinnati, which was only uh, several hours south of us. So so I became really interested in that, and I started looking into that program, and then decided like, yeah, I really want to do architecture. I want to be an architect. So that was kind of the I probably made that decision about halfway through high school. So alas, I could have been a rich doctor, but then I went into architecture instead, like a fool.
I see. And what are some funny or struggle stories from your undergrad or grad life?
Oh God. Yeah, I I was really into it, all of the stuff that I think is toxic now, like the all-nighters and, never sleeping and not eating right and stuff. I was like 100% into that and just thought it was part of the culture and was very excited, and it was all very new. I had never lived in a big city before, so I thought Cincinnati was like a huge city, and I was living an urban life, and that was really exciting. And I mean, it is a really cool city and a really interesting way to experience architecture as you're learning about architecture. But I remember also getting pretty burnt out by third year. So I was in a 4-year undergrad program. And I think it was the third year. I started looking into transferring out of architecture
Whoa.
school and doing other things, because I was just like bummed. Um, and I had also had a really like I had a studio I didn't like. It was a sustainability studio actually, and I hated it. Which like I'm not anti-sustainability. I think it was just the pedagogy. But and then I had a and also that was like I think that was the time I stayed up for like 3 nights in a row or something and like almost died. So it was just like pushed to the max. And I had a really boring internship where I just worked on like underground parking garages in ArchiCAD for like several months. So it was just like, this sucks. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I looked into transferring out, but then I kind of thought, I'm so close to just getting this degree. And I ended up coming back for my final year and really enjoying my final year and being happy that I stayed with it. There was also I went to DAP at Cincinnati, which is the building is actually called the Aronoff Center and was designed by Peter Eisenman. So I also had this antagonistic relationship with this weird building. Um, as an architecture student, it was kind of a surreal experience. So every time we had a bad time in that building, we would just blame it on Peter Eisenman, who was also notorious for taking us as interns and not paying us. So we had a bone to pick. But so yeah,
So
that was
many
that for
revelations.
yeah, yeah. But I did some other things in undergrad too. Like I was really interested. I had this like fantasy at one point of double majoring in English literature and architecture, which of course wasn't physically possible without like more years of school. But I did manage to take some creative writing workshops, and that was really important to me to be able to get outside of the space of the design school, which was all consuming. Like you could just spend your entire college life just in that one building, which is a real shame because I wanted that like typical American college campus like life. So I was able to get out of there every once in a while and do my creative writing exercises, and that was a really you know that was really important to me at that age.
So that's the context behind your creative tweets.
Yeah. Yes, I owe that to my creative writing workshops. How to compose the perfect tweet. No,
I see.
Twitter came later. That was not a technology yet, thank God. So I wasn't wasting time on the internet.
Got it. So from getting frustrated in third year and thoughts about transferring into other discipline to getting passionate about technology, thinking about grad school, like, oh, what happened?
Yeah, I was always like more technology oriented than usual. I would say, or than the typical student, perhaps, because I had that background in 3D modeling. Drawing was really painful for me, so that's like a big part of the architecture school I went to was like years of like hand drawing courses. And like you can teach it, and I definitely got good at drawing from not being able to draw at all, but I hated it. In my mind, drawing is just the immediacy of your brain to some medium. So I had always considered what I did in 3D modeling to be sketching and drawing. And you know you're stubborn when you're young and you just want to do that. It's good to learn other ways of designing and producing and be exposed to that. But I really came to believe that it was okay for me to ideate and sketch in 3D. So that was kind of a thread when I was trying to decide where I wanted to go for grad school. I was like looking at I don't, I don't know if my brain was fully developed back then when I was thinking about grad school. So I was like, okay, I want to go to like, Columbia seems to be like the coolest school where I get to do crazy digital things and I'm going to learn how to script. Be so cool if I could script. That's all I cared about was like learning how to script, but I had nothing I needed to script for but then I got denied from Columbia, and then I also applied to Princeton. And I think the only reason I applied there is because it's like the smallest architecture class, and I
Oh,
just was like, that's really elite. So if I got into there, I don't know, people would respect me. I guess I don't know what the thinking was. And I got, of course, denied from Princeton as well. So Cincinnati at the time was transitioning their graduate program, and I think it was a new graduate program. So they really needed students, and they needed. It's not you. It's unusual to take a bunch of your undergrads into your graduate program, but that was kind of the era and what they were doing. And I had applied for a graduate assistantship in what was called the Rapid Prototyping Center, which is a digital fabrication facility, laser 3D printing, CNC machining, that was primarily used by the industrial and transportation design students. But they did give assistantships to graduate architecture students. So you would get to, I forget what it was. I think it was like you worked like 10 hours a week or something in
Okay.
that lab. Um, and I had got that position and I got denied everywhere else. So I was like, okay, well, it could be worse. So I'll just stay in Cincinnati. I like Cincinnati. And I that's when I started working in the Rapid Prototyping Center. And the Rapid Prototyping Center, it wasn't like a typical academic like fab lab, because most fab labs are teaching facilities. Like you go in there to learn about digital fabrication. This was not that. This was like a professional job shop, like ran by like a master carpenter and like CNC machinist who had worked at I think Hasbro before, when they transitioned from handmade molds to CNC machine molds. He showed me some of the original GI Joe molds that they had made, and
Oh.
teeny tiny like hair width CNC bits that they used to do like all of the detailing for like the Cobra Commander masks and stuff like that. It was really cool. Um, so that was really good because it was super professional. So like I became like a professional like CNC programmer and machinist. um on the software side, we used Delcam Power Mill, which has since been acquired by Autodesk. Super sophisticated cam software. And then we had like vertical machining centers. We had routers. We also had a 5-axis. And then on our largest Como router, we also had some fourth axis attachments as well. So we did some really sophisticated setups, and I made like a lot of car parts and like electric bicycle parts and hand tools and things like that. So it was a really good way of exercising my mind. I had this history with like NURBS modeling, which is
Hmm.
also really popular in product and transportation design. And it was nice too, because you kind of got exposure to full like design to fabrication, iterative workflows for different disciplines. So um, whereas my background was largely in Rhino. And you would see like the industrial design students using SolidWorks for like solid modeling and assemblies, and you would see the transportation design students using Alias, which is like Rhino on crack, for like really advanced NURBS Class A surface modeling. And you'd also see like what data is inherent in those types of modelers that also like lends downstream intelligence to manufacturing. So there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with CAM software to drive tool paths from like surface isocurve structures and do parametric tool pathing. Not even like, you don't even have to like script or use Grasshopper or anything. Those are just tools in like advanced CAM software that can extract that kind of information. The flow, right, of a particular surface can be used in its actual subtractive machining. And like working with solid modeling and assemblies also led me to doing like an independent grad school study in digital project, which was like the Gary Technologies like CATIA
Hmm.
instantiation. So which was also, I think, my very first exposure to parametric or like adaptive design, driving things with parameters, like seeing beams resize as I like moved walls and changed spacing. So that was like a year or two before I had ever tried Grasshopper, and I think a year or two after I had first tried generative components. And generative components confuse the shit out of me. I think I was like I was still an undergrad. So I did an internship at KPF in undergrad, and KPF has a really amazing design technology culture and a lot of resources. So I think I was like 19. I was wearing all like Mansfield, Ohio Goodwill clothes because like I knew you were supposed to dress up in New York. I was like, oh, I'm going to New York City. I gotta like be dressed up at an architecture firm. I must have looked like so awful. But you know, I didn't have any money. Uh, uh, anyway, so they had like Revit. They had pre Autodesk Revit, and it was like Charles River software. And they had generative components because a lot of the people who worked at Bentley like also worked at KPF. So there's some like I'm sure like OG computational design name drops I could do if I could like remember everybody's name off the top of my head. But there's a gentleman named Kyle Steinfeld who was working there before
Mhm.
he got his PhD. I think he teaches out west now, and he's like a pretty brilliant mind in the space. And he was like really nice to me because I was just some like annoying intern, I'm sure. And I, you know, he it was like the first time I'd seen Rhino script, and the first time I'd seen generative components, and the first time I'd heard of BIM and seen Revit. And I tried all of it, but it was all very confusing and overwhelming to me. I had no computer science experience. I had extensive 3D modeling experience, but that did not translate into like generative I remember like the first thing I tried to do in generative components was to establish a relative frame or a relative coordinate system. And that idea in and of itself was like too much for me. Like I was like, well, no, there's 1000 and XYZ. Why would there be another one? So like it was all like kind of overwhelming, and I really stepped away from that sort of technology. So in grad school, like most of what I focused on was um, more and more complex modeling, but still like manual modeling, bringing like Maya into my toolkit and learning how to use animation and simulation tools. Real Flow was another one that I used a lot. And and also just making like kind of wacky shit because I had done an internship at RAC, Francois Roche's studio in Paris. So was kind of exploring like those ideas, but also sometimes confusing those ideas with like technical craft and you know thinking that the designs were about it was about scripting or it was about using weird geometry and workflows and not that it was like a political act, you
Mhm.
know, to introduce like radical form or different and uncomfortable ideas into urban spaces. That all kind of sunk in a little bit later. So you know you're in when you're young you just kind of mimic, um, so just trying to mimic that style of work. And then I think and I didn't really get into I don't think I got into yeah I didn't get into like grasshopper in any serious way until like I had tried it in Paris when it was called explicit history, and there were
Mhm.
no data trees yet, and it was like again I was just like what is this, I'm confused. I have a lot of like all of my early stories are just like opening something, being confused, and walking away for a few years.
Yeah.
um
Sorry to age you here. Like, which year are we talking?
The first year I opened, so like, uh, I think 2004 or five was the first time I opened generative components, Revit, and RhinoScript, which would have been probably VB.net
Mhm.
as the language. And then it would have been 2008 that I first opened Explicit History because that was the first year Grasshopper came out. So I think it was called Explicit History for
Oh.
like a year. And then it was called Grasshopper in like, we'll say roughly like beginning of 2009. And then 2009 is when I graduated into the recession and was like, could not get, I just wanted to, also like, I had all this love for technology, but I just wanted to be an architect. Like, I didn't want to be like a specialist. The thought had never really occurred to me, but then I couldn't get a job. So I was like, what if I stayed at the Rapid Prototyping Center but started opening it up to architects and interior designers and like urban planners and
Mhm.
brought that discipline into digital craft. And so I did, which was awesome. I got to do that job. It was super fun. Um, spent a lot of time explaining why SketchUp isn't good for downstream digital fabrication. That became a thread through like a big part of my career was trying to police the use of SketchUp. But SketchUp's fine, by the way. It's just, if you're trying to do CNC machining off of SketchUp, it's a little weird, or it was at the time at least. And then started teaching as well. So then I was just like the young junior faculty member who knew about computers, and there was a petition. Like the grad students actually like sent a like signed petition to the like graduate school office that said we demand to be taught Grasshopper.
Really?
Yes. So I had already taught my first seminar. I taught my first digital fabrication seminar, which was this really bizarre class where you where I made you use Rhino, and I made you use like very elaborate isocurve extraction tools and like surface drawing tools to basically draw tool paths, and then use CAM, so Delcam Power Mill, to use those to drive um, actual tool machining operations. And Natalie Gattegno, the designer from Future Cities Lab, came and gave a lecture, and then she kind of like did like a meta critique of my seminar, which is like super awesome to have somebody like her do that. And then she was like, you should really like look at parametric software for this. Like what you're doing is kind of like manually insane. And I'm like, that was my jam. Like I would do something that would like have benefited tremendously from automation, but just like I loved the tedium. I think I just like loved the, okay, I know what I'm doing for the next 36 hours. Nobody talk to me sort of thing. I'm gonna, you know, unfold this
Flow zone.
complex geometry manually or whatever. So she's like, I was like, okay. And this for me, there was a lesson here, which was like I had dipped in and out of like various like computation tools, not really knowing how to engage with them. I think by and large because I never had a problem that required that tool set. So this was a case where I was like, okay, I should really teach. And this coincided with this petition demanding Grasshopper. So then it all happened. It was like, I should really teach how to do this in an automated way. And we should use Grasshopper. And like, then we can parameterize the toolpath extraction. We can parameterize that relative to like the actual available tool bit sizes. So now we're talking about kind of constrained design spaces because we know what we're doing downstream, and that really appealed to me, as did the idea of creating like intelligent models that could drive downstream manufacturing processes. So I I lived on Main Street in Over the Rhine, which is like downtown Cincinnati.
Mhm.
And there was a coffee shop like right next door to where I lived, and I would go in there like every night after work and teach myself Grasshopper, because you only have to stay like 24 hours ahead of your students. That's like every junior faculty's dirty trick is they're like, I actually barely know more than my students. I just learn it one day ahead of them. It's just like, I'm actually trying to find the name of it was called Iris Book Cafe on Main Street, Cincinnati. So I would go there like every night, and all I was doing was like using like the ISO curve component and figuring out how that interacted with one surface, with a set of
Mhm.
surfaces. What happened if I fed it a list? What happened when I fed it a number? So it was really only using like one or two components, but just trying to understand data trees and how
Mhm.
that all worked. And I mean, I talk about this a lot. Like it took me years to be good at Grasshopper. Like, you know, it probably took me 2009. It probably took me like 4 years of like constantly using it and working through different problem sets to actually call myself good. By the time I worked at like Woods Bagot, where I was like, no,
Mhm.
I'm an expert in how to use this. But I mean, that was like a 4 or 5 year journey of mostly self education. So that's another lesson too, which is like you're not I think some people just expect that you can like take a few seminars in school and just be good at Grasshopper. And it's like, no, this is like a commitment. This is a long
Mhm.
term relationship that you're entering. And it's only worth entering that relationship if you know that it's going to be productive for you and solve problems that can be solved with other tool sets or technologies or processes. So I taught that seminar for several years, and and then it kind of went where Grasshopper wasn't just for the toolpathing aspects. It broadened, and Grasshopper was used for the actual, geometry creation and manipulation and the toolpath. And then we'd start to understand there was like an ecosystem of the way that these models and the things intertwine. So you'd have your kind of, we'll say, like form finding, and then you had your fabrication, and then we'd bring in like material constraints. So what does it mean to machine into like plywood glue lam versus like multi-material glue lam, which is what I started doing more when I was at Pratt. um, and that kind of led me through, I think I was in Cincinnati after school for like 2.5 years, and then got hired at City Tech, which is a CUNY school in Dumbo, Brooklyn, with an undergraduate architectural technology program. So they had a huge grant there called the Fuse Lab grant from the National Science Foundation. And it was basically an opportunity like where, I had trained in a well-established fabrication lab, and it was an opportunity to set one up from scratch myself, like
Mm-hmm.
design the lab space, order the equipment, design curriculum around that, and to support that. So I thought it was like a nice opportunity for me to start something of my own. And that's when I moved to Brooklyn in January 2012.
I see. So tell me, like, when you were graduating, like, what were and you were exposed to a lot of tools and technology, and you were like self-learning. Were there any like technology you said, okay, this is gonna change AC industry, I'm betting high on this, apart from Grasshopper? What are the things that came true? What are the things that went south?
Yeah. I didn't really think like that at the time. Like I wasn't thinking about transforming the industry. I was just hoping to be part of it. And when I graduated in 2009 with my graduate degree with my MArch, I didn't know Grasshopper or scripting or anything like that. I was just a really good like 3D modeler. Oh, and I was also very good at making physical models, which is kind of a bad thing because then you just get thrown into the model shop forever, and like they don't realize that maybe you could also be a designer. Um, so like I was just eager to get into practice and get like experience and try to work my way up as like an architect, and wasn't really thinking about, where the industry was going or how to transform it. That really didn't happen. That didn't even happen really when I was teaching Grasshopper either. I just felt like I was exploring like architecture adjacent ideas, and I didn't think too hard about it, to be honest. And it wasn't really until I was at City Tech in Brooklyn, because now like it was like the reason the grant was in place and the reason we were changing the curriculum was to give better opportunities to our students. The main like thesis was just training architecture students today, it kind of does them a disservice, especially like in such a weak economy at the time. Which is say not everyone is going to perform the same like traditional architectural role. So what did we see as like the fundamental kind of like pillars of other skill sets that they could specialize in? So we came up with 3 tracks. BIM, of course. One that I think we started calling it sustainability and then ended up calling it performance driven design. And then a third, which we called computational fabrication, which was to differentiate it a little bit from digital fabrication, because I think digital fabrication, at least in our eyes, kind of just implied a workflow. I have a CAD model, I export, I have a really old diagram of this somewhere. Like I export like a, exchange file format. I bring that into CAM, I perform my CAM operation, blah, blah, blah. And computational fabrication kind of said there's this whole ecosystem. You can have a centralized data set that moves through different models. It's not an import export situation necessarily. You have these like global parameters. And then you also have these like interdependent like ecosystems that are assisted by computational technologies like scripting or automation or just really computer science and software at large. And that was also, my thinking with all the tool pathing stuff too, right? Which was we can actually run downstream specific analysis, right? So we can we can run curvature analysis on the surface to understand what tool set we need, like what size bits out of the available library we have downstream. We can analyze this for undercuts so we understand how many machining positions it requires. Is this a flip mill or does this require multi-axis machining? If it is multi-axis, what are the approaches? If it is like flipped or rotated, what extra jigs do we need? And I did a lot of like workshops around like going really deep into that sort of thing, which is like how can you throw as much of that upstream as possible such that when you are ready to take your data set into cam, it's like optimized for that process, but also leverages that process to be efficient. Like, just in terms of geometric complexity, one of the things that fascinated me about toolpath artifacts, the idea that you would coarsely machine something to leave like the kind of leftover material or cusping behind, was that you could create really, really complex geometry without having to explicitly model that. And I really liked that as like an efficient modeling method. And now, like, does it matter how complex your geometry is? Like, is there value in that in and of itself? Not necessarily, but at the time I thought that was cool. Um, so that all kind of was like, let's differentiate computational fabrication from digital fabrication. I think that phrase was coined by Mode Lab. So Ronnie Parsons and Gil Akos, they had gone to Columbia and then formed a design consultancy and studio called Mode Lab, and they had served as consultants for the Fuse Lab NSF grant. And they're definitely mentors to me and bringing me into the like eye-opening world of like Grasshopper plus digital fabrication. So the idea then was that we had students who would go and work for sustainability consultants, or they would work for architectural
Mhm.
fabricators, or they would work on like design technology teams. And I'm really proud of the students we graduated in those like several years that I taught there, because if you know anything about the CUNY system, it tends to be, especially at City Tech, it tends to be students from the boroughs. Like these are local students, and typically lower income students as well that don't really have opportunities to travel or go to other universities. And their dream is to go to City College, which is like, that's where you get the Bachelor of Architecture. But if you don't get into City College, then your backup school is City Tech, and it's actually like a Bachelor of Architectural Technology. It's not like an accredited program for architecture, but that's what made it awesome, was that we didn't have to adhere to um, some outdated idea of what architectural practice was, which is like essentially what NCARB has been pushing, and really like limiting and gatekeeping who can get licensed, which, and then, shocking, now no one's getting licensed. And they're panicking that there are no architects anymore. And we just thought like, let's, we're thinking about like the gatekeeping, we're thinking about like diversity in the field, and how to give like local lower income students the same shot at getting into this field and this profession. And we're also just thinking about the realities of the economy, which is like there's just no way in hell that all of these students can work at architecture firms. So that was a really important moment. And I would say that like, of every job I worked, I think I'm most proud of those 3 years, because I do feel
Mhm.
like not just me, obviously, but the entire faculty there and the kind of all the supporting stakeholders around that really made a difference in a generation of young students' lives.
Yeah, and I could see the impact in the lives and the change it's creating. And whenever you're talking about fabrication over the air, I could feel how much passionate you are about the technology. So afterwards, like I'm curious to know your thoughts. So for the students out there listening to this podcast and watching this, there are various technology they can focus. Like they can either focus on digital fabrication, AI, generative design,
Yeah.
robotics. Like, what's your piece of advice?
Oh goodness. Well, I wouldn't be too prescriptive in which of those things they focused on. It's sometimes hard to give advice. You know, I think I was like privileged in certain ways. and had certain opportunities that were kind of just fell into my lap. And then also I had things outside of my control that directed my career. I mean, like, I don't know if I would be in technology at all if it weren't for the recession. It's really hard to say. So for me to be like, this is how you get from A to B, and like, this is how you think about it, would be a little bit disingenuous. I was just always really curious person and wanted to kind of sometimes to a fault too. Like, I mean, I had like no social life, like, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but like, I was just so interested in learning as much as I could about what it meant to practice architecture.
Hmm.
But then I also kind of trusted my gut that it was okay to be interested in things that didn't fit neatly into how I was being taught. um, I remember like another thing I did a lot of independent studies in grad school because I just couldn't get any like good technology courses. It just wasn't a big part of the culture. It was a little bit traditional. So
Hmm.
like I had mentioned one that I did in with the Gary Technologies stuff, but like I did another one to learn Maya. Um and just spent like a semester like animating a jellyfish in Maya and like learning a bunch of the tools there because I had this instinct that like understanding animation software, you know, I think a lot of it is just like chasing something shiny. Like I was
Hmm.
seeing what like Greg Lynn was doing and I was seeing what the elite grad schools were doing. I was just kind of mimicking that, but I also kind of instinctively felt like yes, even though we're kind of appropriating this technology from other fields like entertainment, this feels like it offers some additional like flexibility and design that could be useful in architecture later. And you know, it was interesting too because the if you jump to like 2015, I think, or 2016, when I was in the middle of teaching at Pratt in their graduate architecture and urban design program, I inherited the like Maya class for a few years. I think it was called architectural animation, but it had traditionally been about using Maya. How do you use the dimension of time to animate? At that time, it was like very old school because Columbia had been exploring that to death for a while. And I said, and I was also working at Woods Baggett and Shane Berger, who runs the design technology team there. We were starting to explore VR as a client experience. I think the first Oculus Rift had just come out, and we were all like learning how to use Unity and like finding that it was like pretty user friendly and we could do some pretty like quick and amazing stuff. So I just decided like we're actually going to, we'll do a Maya module. You should still kind of understand the history of this program, but the future feels like game engines and the future feels like VR, AR, MR. So um, I started teaching Unity for the purposes. So we would make architecture in Maya. It would have to be some kind of animated architecture. We would figure out how to bring that animation plus geometry uh, plus materiality into Unity, and then we kind of build an environment around that. You know, you can like there's some trees and some wind, and then we also did this really funny thing that I was obsessed with, which is we used Mass Motion, which is like a crowd simulation software, and figured out how to export all of the people. And the people are like these like low res like zombies, so they kind of like walk like this, so you had like all of these like weird like zombie like White Walkers like and but then you'd have people in there too. And I was always talking about like, architecture renderings and experiences never have other people, which is like so weird. It was funny too because you'd make those people colliders as well so that you could physically interact with them. But then if you'd put too many people into your architectural model and you couldn't actually like move through because you were just like bumping into people. So it was like Maya, Mass Motion, so like architecture, people, bring that all together in Unity and then export. At the end of the day, the whole idea was to export a VR app. And that semester was when I think it like Google came out with the cardboard thing. So the beginning of being able to just use your phone, which was awesome. I mean, we were still we're still like using Oculus Rifts to get like the higher quality experience, but like it really democratized things to just be able to use your phone. That was, and then um and then I think the era of like authoring more sophisticated apps where you could use like the Oculus controllers as like UI interface and draw in VR. Then that whole wave started coming, and then I was like, I am not like good at this. Like, like I could teach about this much. So then like other people came into Pratt who were like better at like authoring like AR apps and interactivity and UI and stuff. And we had also brought Andrew Human on at Woods Baggett, and he was getting into all the iOS like authoring side of things. So that's when I kind of gently stepped out of the I would say like game engine mixed reality space. But just enough to get my toes wet and like kind of reorient some of the curriculum to a place that I thought better served those students.
Hmm. If you were to form a six-member team of AC techies, who would
Oh,
you select?
God. Come on. Man, there are just so many. Obviously, Andrew Human, my best friend, who I've worked at several jobs with. Um, I feel like this is one of those questions that could be designed to like make people mad or upset for being left out.
It's time to put
But
you on a spot.
yeah, I mean, I could just randomly throw. I mean, I did more recently. I've done a little bit of work with my friend Maria Yablanina. She teaches at the University of Toronto. She actually makes robots from scratch. She's a brilliant designer and roboticist, and we kind of collaborated a little bit on how to bring in like you know how to use like a design computation tool to kind of reorganize your own office space, but then also send that information to robots. So, I mean, it's the same ideas I've always been interested
Mhm.
in, which is like I have some kind of intelligent model. I'm adding like a UI kind of component to that, and then I'm using that data to drive something downstream with machines. I'm just switching from like a CNC machine to mobile robots to like physically reconfigure a space, so to interact in the architectural space itself rather than being like an isolated machine in a factory. So we could throw her on that team as well. God, I mean, there's so much talent in the space. There's somebody, there's also people like adjacent to the space, like they're not necessarily designers, but what they're researching is really interesting. So there's a woman named Cynthia Brosk who's at Stanford, and like she teaches these really amazing like kind of post grad courses in how do I actually evaluate the value of robots, construction robots on the job site. Like how do we
Mhm.
actually, like, now that there are these emerging like products, how do we test them and how do we put like ROI numbers on that so that we can kind of better advocate for scaling that technology in the field. So I think that's really interesting work. I think uh, another kind of Madeline Gannon is certainly a designer, but like has really thought about human machine interfaces, right? So now
Mhm.
that architects and designers work more with these machines, how do we actually, like, is it all just like I'm typing at a computer and I send a text file, or can we actually use like gesture control and voice control? Like, how do our bodies interact with these things in physical spaces? And she's done a lot of like really interesting kind of work in that area. um I don't know, we should probably throw in some like AI person too, like, right. There's so much. Those are just a few like random names that come to mind.
You
Oh,
got
there's,
four.
speaking of AI, I just saw Nono post. So like there's somebody who's like, I mean, gosh, when I first met Nono Martinez Alonso, by the way, if you don't know him already, like he was doing a residency at the Autodesk Build Space in Boston, and I don't even. I think I might be mixing up my Boston trips. I might have been there for Design Allies to interview Madeline Gannon, and then I think I might have run into Nono who's doing a residency there. Um, and that was like the first time that I saw like a designer interacting with like machine learning and thinking about what are the possibilities there. and he and he worked. He's also really close with Jose Luis Garcia, who teaches at the GSD and teaches this. You know, he does these like interactive like grasshopper courses too. He's like an amazing educator. You know, like I would, if I were going to school right now, I'd definitely want to take his class and kind of learn computation through his eyes. And he just runs like a brilliant seminar that kind of introduces students to generative design and AI. And he just kind of takes all of the zeitgeist and all of these kind of principles and how they're emerging and how they interact and kind of creatively explores that with his students. So I don't know. Did I get to six? I forget
No, you
almost.
got five.
I
Yeah.
got to five. Okay. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I feel
And
like
any
hold on, it should be so we should get somebody more senior, right? Like who inspired me. Um how about like Martha Sakari from like Foster and Partners, right? So she's someone now who's in like a leadership position at like, you know, one of arguably the world's most influential architecture firm. She was doing like generative components at Smart Geometry when I was just like going into college, and I've always followed her. That's a cool story too, because then she became my customer and actually did some of the seminal like research into the use of Spot to create a construction digital twin and kind of validating, you know, design intent as represented by BIM relative to the actual reality capture, you know, what actually happens on a job site and kind of tracking those differences and understanding how to control or kind of mediate those differences. So yeah, let's get someone like who's more of an influence on that team too. So that's just a random first six people. I thought that's not a bad team. I'd hang out with
yeah,
them.
yeah, that's very like diverse team.
Yeah.
And how does a day in your life look like?
Right now,
Yep.
um, I let's see. Um, well, I'm a product manager, so I am not using Grasshopper. Um, I design a lot. Shout out, thank you. Oh, I forgot Zach. I forgot to put Zach Downey on my team. Oh no. My Designalize co-host. Designalize, by the way, used to like it started as like a video tutorial site, and some of when I was teaching myself Grasshopper, I was like watching Zach Downey's like Designalize videos, and he had a lot of really great ones for Python too. And then I met him at CUNY and started hanging out at his office a lot just because I thought he was cool and smart. And then we ended up just doing, we were always like drinking beers with like random people passing through the school who were interested in the same things we were. And then we're like, let's just record this. And that's what Designalize was. What question was I supposed to be answering? Sorry, I got sidetracked.
Like how does a day in your life look like?
Oh, right. Yeah. So now as a product manager, I use Asana. So I'm all about that process automation. So set up email is the devil. If you haven't read A World Without Email, you should read it and like wake up from the nightmare that is most knowledge work. Um, so I have a lot of automation set up in my email, either aggressively filtering it out or converting it into tasks and then managing those tasks in Asana, prioritizing those on a, I want to call it like a sprint, but just on a weekly basis to understand what's the achievable scope of work this week and what's the priority, and then kind of working through those items. So that's when I'm like working at home and have time to sit down and kind of plan my day and like execute things methodically. Um, if I don't get like distracted by Twitter or the news or something. But a lot of times I'm on the road. So a day in my life is like waking up in a hotel and trying to remember where I am in the world, and then going to a customer job site with Spot and working with that customer to get them toward operational use of the robot. So, you know, over the last 3 years working with Spot, we've kind of gone from When I was a customer, it was really about product market fit, like where might a quadruped be useful in various industries. And then it was about early adopters to say, well, we've got product market fit in construction, but what are the actual applications? And then we said, oh, okay, autonomous laser scan surveys and autonomous job site monitoring with like photo documentation are like the two applications. And now how do we build better solutions around that? And then how do we work with that to bring value to customers faster so that they can get the robot out of their innovation groups or they're testing multiple applications on multiple sites and do site specific pilots where they're like, okay, I really just want to do autonomous laser scanning and track my work in place and look for deviations from BIM. And I'm going to like run those missions every night and kind of build up this four-dimensional data set of my site. And then that also can form the basis of a construction twin that can then later be adopted into like an operational twin, hand off to the owner, and exploring those ideas. And my goal is to just make that robot like so useful that you naturally want to use it every day, and the rest kind of takes care of itself. So that's like so much of what I do is just being on site with customers and using the robot. um, Last summer, the thrust was all about our new autonomy system. So originally, the autonomy system was kind of on a rail, right? Like the robot walked a path and then performed actions on that, like triggered a laser scan. Um, but you can't do that in a dynamic environment. Eventually, somebody builds a wall, or a door gets closed, or they park a scissor lift sideways, and then the robot can't stay on that rail and then can't move laterally far enough, at least not safely and in a controlled way, to consistently get around that. So we kind of decoupled the actions or the inspections that you perform, taking a photo, starting and stopping a video camera, taking a laser scan, um, from the map. So the idea is like you can just take the robot around and just kind of map as much as you want. And then automatically that creates an interconnected topology of possible routes. And then on top of that, you say, okay, I want you to perform these inspection points or these scan points and in this particular order. And then the path planning is automatic through that topology based on that order. It's just kind of the shortest path between those. And then inevitably, you run into a situation you didn't expect where the robot can't get to the inspection point, and then it looks at the overall map and dynamically replans and then continues its mission and goes around. So that level of flexibility, in addition to some other kind of tunable parameters that support all of that, was huge. So I spent like all summer like sweating on. I'm always like either like so sweaty or so cold because you're on construction sites. It's like never perfect. But so that like vastly improved the autonomy system. And then, once you have that in your core product, then you kind of go back to your services and your APIs and you strengthen those so the other developers can also leverage that. And that's really where we're at right now, too, because we said, hey, like, not as we expand into more customers, people aren't going to want to say like, oh, I'm going to buy a robot and figure out how to use it. They're going to say, I want an autonomous scanning solution because that's valuable. I don't, if it has a robot, fine, but that's not what I'm buying. So that's why we have a strategic alliance with Trimble. So, Trimble is a huge construction company. They've got BIM and CAD and field devices, laser scanners, GNSS receivers, total stations. So they have the expertise to really like bring Spot to market as like a full construction solution, not just a robot. So have been really working hand in hand with them on their scanning product and some of the other things they're developing through Trimble Field Link, which is like their field interface for all those devices. So now it's just all those devices go on a robot and you can automate those workflows. So I also spend a lot of time either working with them in our headquarters in Waltham, Boston Dynamics, or flying out to Denver, where one of the big Trimble offices is, collaborating with them on their Trimble solutions. So I would say roughly like 1 week at home, 1 week on the road, kind of back and forth is how it goes. So that's why I gave you such a long and meandering answer to what's a day in the life, because it's not like super consistent.
Yeah, and if you want to see Brian sweaty or hustling, check out his Instagram. He shares a lot of travel
Yeah.
stories. But
Well, now my Instagram is mostly pictures of weird like robot movies or like any movie with a weird vehicle in it, and I just take a photo of like the screen that I'm watching. So my Instagram has become horrible, but you're welcome to follow along if it pleases you.
Very archaic. And you mentioned about your productivity hack about email, and
Yeah.
this is my last question before we conclude the interview. Like, what are other life hacks you have, or productivity hacks you have in place?
Yeah. So I'm not I'm not like super into life hacking. The thought kind of just exhausts me. Like I don't want to have to think about my life the same way I think about work. So like I really work hard for like kaizen or improvement moments at work, minimizing email, better scheduling methods, understanding how to better utilize like meetings, better collaboration, how to like block off time for deep focus work. All these things that I kind of were inspired by a world without email and similar books, but really also took like a team effort. Like the whole product team really had to buy into that and support each other in implementing new workflows. So continuous improvement is really important to me at work. Like in life, I mean, I don't know. I like try to like have one, right? So the ability to kind of disconnect at the end of the day, spend time with family and relax. I recently moved to Long Island, so in the summer I get to spend a lot of time on the water, which is really fun. I got my boating safety certificate several weeks ago, which is exciting.
Well,
Yeah, it's kind of there's no like boating license in New York, but like by I think 2025, everybody has to have this like certificate to operate one. So in my future fantasy world where I'm driving around on a boat out in the water, and I like to exercise and I like to play basketball and play soccer. And when I go to Colorado, I like to try to make time to snowboard. Um, so I'm not just always constantly thinking about work and doing stuff. So like I don't do a lot of like I'm not like building robots in my free time. Like the idea doesn't particularly appeal to me because it's just like more work and my brain is fried. So I try to do something else. And I've got like a niece and a nephew out here who are very cute little babies, and a couple more on the way this spring. So I like to spend time with them as well.
yeah, no more 3 days all nighter.
No, not really. Every once in a while, I'll have a red eye flight that I can't sleep on. That's about as close as I get to all nighters these days, thankfully.
I see. So I have a rapid fire round to conclude the interview. You will
Uh,
only get 10-15 seconds, and you got to keep your answer brief.
oh, jeez.
Okay.
Okay.
Which city is in your travel bucket list?
Like ones that I haven't been to yet.
It's open.
Oh, okay. Well, my favorite city that I've ever been to is probably between like Berlin and Mexico City and Copenhagen. Cities I'd really love to go to someday. I have never been to Japan or India, so I'd really like to do that. And I'd like to go into like the North Seas, like Faroe Islands or Shetland or North Scotland or something like that.
I can make you itinerary for India.
Yes, that
Okay.
would be awesome.
I see. Any technical or business book which made a big impact in your life?
Definitely a world without email. But the other one is Crossing the Chasm, which is specific to how to bring like a high tech product to market, especially. And the chasm is kind of the space between the early adopters, which can give you like a misleading idea of how popular the product is, to the early majority, which are like people, normal companies waiting to see, is this actually useful? Are my competitors using it? And that's a tricky time in a company's life.
I see. Your favorite movie?
Oh my god, that's impossible. Jeez, there's like so many sci-fi movies I like. What? That's an impossible question for me because I'm so like passionate about sci-fi movies. I like couldn't possibly answer that. I can tell you the latest one I watched, which which was horrible. It was a terrible movie. It was called Battle Truck. It's from 1982, and it's like a post-apocalyptic movie where like a guy on a Suzuki motorcycle fights this person in like an armored semi truck. It's by Harley Cokless, who is an interesting director. Had also directed a really fun movie that's actually pretty good called Black Moon Rising, about how like an experimental car gets stolen. I'm not keeping this short at all. I'm just like rambling about weird movies. Next question.
I see. I'll make it easy. Your favorite restaurant.
My favorite restaurant. Um, oh yeah, there's a restaurant called. Speaking of India, Ambar India, which
Oh,
is in Clifton, which is a neighborhood in Cincinnati. Cincinnati's engineering school brings quite a bit of people in from India. There's like a huge population there, and they have good. What's amazing about Cincinnati is they have like the best North and South Indian cuisine. So it's like if you're like a dosa person versus a I don't know saag paneer person, like just it's all there and it's all so good and it's better than what I've had in New York even. So now I haven't had it in India, um, but in terms of like if you're not in India, I truly believe that Cincinnati has the best Indian food.
as- I see Mark asking your podcast question. What is architecture?
God, I don't know how
Stupidest answer only.
anything that has a toilet in it, right? What were all the weird answers we used to get? I don't, and everybody was just like, I couldn't possibly define this. I mean, architecture is like lowercase or capital, right? So there's the discipline of architecture, which is how we think about it usually in school and how we think about it as like a culture. What does it mean to us? How do we practice there? And then there's like the practice of architecture, like the business of building buildings. But like, what is architecture today? I would say like a one of the services involved in delivering buildings that has had its kind of scope vastly reduced over the years through the limitation of liability and perhaps does not serve much of a future function. We shall see.
I see. And lastly, anything you wish you would have done differently in life?
Okay, so I don't think that way, because I don't really think we often don't think on time scales large enough. So like something that I thought was a bit, I don't know, like, oh, I wish the recession hadn't happened so I could have gone into architecture, but I feel like that worked out for me, even though it felt really bad at the time. So I think we often don't think on time scales long enough. I don't think we can really judge whether things were mistakes or not. I mean, the other part of this too is that I believe that like time is a rail and that like free will is an illusion. So like whatever's going on, like whatever happened, man, and you have to kind of look forward. But I guess if I could, I mean, anytime I think about how I could change my behavior, it is 100% always. I wish I had been kinder to people and I wish I had spent more time with people I love. So I think like those are perhaps kind of overarching themes, but other than that, I don't look back too much.
Got it. And I might invite you couple of years in future from recording this. What is Brian's life in 2025?
Um, Spots have completely taken over construction at that point. No, I think ideally what we'd be talking about is like how commonplace robotics are in practice, and I think like we could talk about the digital twin more as a common workflow and process. Like what does it mean to here's like what I think the digital twin ultimately is like product lifecycle management for a building. So we could say like building lifecycle management, like as a technology process by all the stakeholders who both deliver and operate buildings. Can we like take a long view? Like if I'm advocating for architects in particular, like can they have client relationships that last through an entire building lifetime rather than just being concerned with the delivery of the building? Can they extend their kind of strong priors in 3D modeling, BIM, and building data organization into the actual operation of a building? I'd hope we could be kind of talking about that, or we're talking about like, hey, remember architecture? Remember how that used to be a discipline and now I don't know. Now it's all big tech, real estate and general contractors that have taken over. So it should be a few interesting years. Also, like hopefully we're not like in the middle of like a pandemic and a European war. Like hopefully the world gets its head on straight. So we'll see.
I see some sci-fi vibes here where a big corp is taking over.
Yeah,
Okay,
maybe. It's hard to not think too dystopian into the future, but we can still hold out hope.
okay. Uh, I just want to ask this last question. So you just need to answer bullish or bearish. Metaverse,
Bearish.
AI in architecture,
Bullish, but probably not the way most people think about AI.
blockchain in architecture, AEC.
Bearish.
All right. I think that's it. I have. It was a fun. It was a very fun time hosting you. Thanks a lot for sharing your journey and thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
See you. Have a nice rest of your day.
Bye bye, you too.